I would like to start out by saying no one told me you started with NASA before I agreed to be on this panel.
That's all right.
I would have politely declined.
No, that's okay. One thing, fair disclosure, I'm one of the original authors of the LoRaWAN specification. So it's kind of my fault, along with a group of others. And we're still in the technical committee. So any feedback you have on that, I would love to hear from you on anything dealing with LoRaWAN, because maybe we can make it happen for you.
And interestingly enough, I am the marketing committee chair for the LoRa Alliance. So any of the things non-technical that you aren't happy with, please bring to me. So I'm joined here by my esteemed colleague, David Smith. If you don't recognize him, that's his, I asked him for his headshot, and that's what he sent me. So he told me that was his headshot. So yes, exactly. Thought I'd keep it on there. Now it's supposed to, after a little while, it's supposed to morph into an actual picture of him. So we'll see what happens. So we had interestingly enough, we had originally planned to put together a really in-depth PowerPoint that basically had you guys leave this room knowing this is how you take LoRaWAN to market. Specifically in how you train your sales and marketing team members. And my thought was there are a lot of companies who come into the ecosystem and they do not have marketing prowess. They don't have big fancy marketing teams. They're new to training their sales teams. And they probably have a lot of questions in the beginning of going forward with the protocol if it's a part of their business model of how do I actually take it to market? How do I train my people on how to sell it? Dave and I met over several different occasions and discussed, and we're both pretty busy people. And the thing we kept thinking about was that you guys will see a lot of PowerPoints, and there's no knock to PowerPoints. But we'd really much rather turn this into what we call a fireside chat, a conversation between us who represent two very different sides of the axis here, and give you guys the opportunity to ask questions and even to steer the topics that we have prepared. So kind of wanted to just set the stage for the format. Any thoughts before we get started? I think he introed us pretty well.
Yeah, he did.
All right, all right.
I'll have to recover from that.
So taking LoRaWAN to market, understanding how to really be able to sell solutions or devices or products that are LoRaWAN capable, it's not always an easy question. There are a lot of nuances, unknowns, and what we'd like to discuss today is those pain points and how can you come out of here better equipped on how to do that? So one of my first thoughts that we talked about was IoT readiness. And you shared with me that that's something you see all the time.
Yes.
That's a problem for your customers, and it can be a barrier at times.
For most customers. So what is IoT readiness? If you are an existing company and you have a digital strategy, right, or product digitization strategy or an IoT strategy or however you want to call it, you're going to be changing in a lot of ways what you currently do to go to market with this new strategy. So if you're a manufacturer, for example, and you make devices and you sell them, if you're going to be offering solutions, right, that's a different sort of thing. What I see all the time is that companies are simply not prepared in a wide number of departments in the company, such as finance, right, IT, OT, customer support, and sales. They're not prepared. So their technical teams run out and they do this awesome thing. They make this great product, which is a solution, right? Sensors, connectivity, a cloud platform, but the company can't sell it or can't bill for it or can't support it. And so one of the things you should do as a company when you want to embark on more of a solution sale is do an internal assessment. We call it an IoT Readiness Assessment. And it should cover all the departments in your company. I can give you some specific examples. Most manufacturing companies, they sell on a CapEx model, right? They get a PO from a customer, they ship the product, and they give an invoice. Most of those kinds of companies are not set up to do subscription management or periodic billing. I've reported to several different CFOs in my career, and hardly any of them would be prepared for some of the changes they would need to see made in their finance department for some of these solutions. So that's an example of one.
Yeah, absolutely. So something that, we see, so Dave absolutely has the experience in deploying solutions, training sales team members on how to sell those solutions and the nuances they find. So to give just a little bit of background, because I don't think my very lengthy, long-winded bio actually covered this, but Oxit is engineering services, design services. So we're kind of in a different aspect of that because we're talking to customers thinking about IoT readiness from a different perspective. So the sales questions that my team members have to ask a prospective client when they're evaluating LoRaWAN is things that really try to flesh out, launch and product assessment, right? So it's like, how ready are they to launch?
Right.
That's the finance side. But that's also decisions on what is the environment of launch going to be like? What are the gateway ratio to the solution, right? To the actual device itself. We also talk about CapEx versus OpEx with our customers, but oddly enough, it's normally not until the almost very end of the process. And I'm just curious from you really quick, like, why do you think that always comes last in IoT readiness?
Usually because you're talking with technical people, right? Or people who are focused on the solution or bringing the solution to market.
Right.
It's the finance people that not only how much money are you spending, but how are you spending it, right? That's when that becomes important, and they usually get engaged at the end, unfortunately. Right. One thing I would have to say is that, you heard me just say, do an IoT readiness assessment. I don't know how many of you know how to do one, right? But there are companies out there that will come in for a fee and they do a really good job, and they will uncover things that you might not have, right? Because you're too close to the trees to see the forest. There was a guy here earlier, James Brown. I know he offers that sort of thing, but you can find people and companies that will come in and do that for you. And so that way you can take, hopefully, unbiased third-party analysis and apply it properly to your enterprise.
So another thing I kind of wanted to touch on under IoT readiness from what we see is common issues that delay deployment. So Dave, when you are working with customers who want an end-to-end ready-to-go solution, beyond the finance question, what are some things that you're seeing that can just delay deployment, period, outside of that finance realm?
Oh, well, wow, there's a lot. So in the LoRa world, we're at the LoRa Alliance Expo, right? LoRa is a very secure protocol, right? The protocol talks about session-based security, network and application, kind of separate security sessions. That's great. But everything outside the protocol is not specified. So in the certification committee right now, I happen to lead that. We're coming up with security certifications. Those would be not about the LoRaWAN security, but about everything outside it. How does a manufacturer generate, install, and store, and provide access to the security keys, right? You hear a lot about that. And how does a network server do that? So one of the things I've seen in the LoRa world, for sure, is that the proper handling and dissemination of keys can stop a deployment, right? Very often, security context like that is an auditable item for a large customer, an enterprise. And so if you're not handling that right, they won't let you deploy it. So I've seen that happen. So the security side outside of the protocol itself is one of those things that you need to understand as you go to do deployments.
Absolutely. The other interesting thing that I've seen stop deployment is, that your customer makes a decision about what they think their customer wants in their product. And we see what we call like feature fragmentation of reality, which is like they had conversations with their customer. They thought these were the features that they needed to design the product around. The customer comes in the 11th hour and says, but I really wanted it to have an Ethernet port. And we've not designed it that way, right? So it can actually stop because of feature fragmentation, and it can actually stop right before manufacturing.
Oh, yeah.
And that leads us into also, so I know you guys, you're dealing with solutions that are ready to go. We're designing and building. But if your customer runs into any type of supply chain or acquisition problems, how do you guys navigate that? How are your people trained to handle that?
The supply chain issues. Well, we all know that they're there, and I hear new issues every day. We were just talking to a supplier last week, where it turns out they have all the electronic components they need, all their boards and all that, all their connectors. They can't get the plastic for their injection molded case.
Very good point.
Right. So you just have to be flexible with that. Sometimes if you anticipate, like today, there are a lot of people who are anticipating problems, right? We have problems today. They anticipate those to continue. So if you can build in deployment flexibility by saying it can be in the plastic case or it can be in the metal case, right? You can provide a risk reduction on your deployment strategy. That's one thing you can do. But that flexibility is often hard to come by.
It is.
Because customers can be very specific, right, about what they want. So, but bringing that into the conversation earlier should work better for you.
So one of the things we do when we work with customers in IoT readiness and things like that is we do a deep dive where we try to unearth as many, and this is on the design side, granted, not off the shelf, but we try to unearth as many of the things they think they know that they don't know, right? So it's like you're literally having a conversation and they're showing you a balloon filled with water and you're trying to poke as many holes in that balloon as you can to uncover if there's a weak spot in the balloon that's going to burst right before you get to manufacturing, right?
Absolutely.
And it could be the same with solutions.
Yeah.
They can be really gung-ho that the solution meets their need only to uncover that there's some kind of missing important piece, right? So before we move into another section of this, does anyone have a question or would like to comment? There are microphones right there. If anyone's brave enough to step up and ask a question on IoT readiness, Dave and I are prepared to answer.
You can heckle.
You can heckle us. Also, we'll allow for that. Yeah, go ahead.
Hello. My name is Marius, and I'm from Norway. I just have a quick question. When we work with some municipalities where they believe that they would like to use these devices or gateways or these products because they have read somewhere or met someone that said these are the products that you should use, but our expert think that that's not going to work, basically. So maybe they believe that they have a higher IoT readiness than what we're not agreeing on their IoT readiness. How do you comment on that?
So you're talking about working with an IoT know-it-all.
Yeah, kind of.
Right.
Yeah, kind of.
That's super common. I mean, I've suffered from it myself. Probably still do.
Right.
What you have to do, see, that's a great example because the wrong time to make all your technology decisions is in the beginning. You have to understand what you're wanting to do, how it needs to work, what are the values that you're going to get from it, how do you ensure to get those values. Down the road is when you make the technology decisions, and those will be obvious by that time, right? So if I were you and I had a customer that came to me and said, I want to use this stuff to do that thing, you say, great, let's talk about what you're doing, make sure I understand, right? What are you really trying to do? What do you see as success, right? What are the benefits you're trying to get?
Right.
And then if you're right and those things won't achieve those, you should be able to show them why at that point, right? But in their own words. And we all know, right? You hate having your own words thrown back at you. And you do it in a nice way, right?
It's an excellent point, like defining their definition of success at the beginning.
Always.
And then qualifying what they feel are the knowns, like, well, we don't agree with you on this decision because we know this is right. Well, then you take it back to their definitions of success. The other thing I think is too, is the value of discovery in the beginning, but being transparent that you're willing to give thought to what they're saying because it's their product. Ultimately, it's their deployment, their solution, but letting them know that you won't hold back disagreeing with them if you feel strongly about it. And then it's up to you to make an ethical decision about, do you feel good about going down that road? If you're talking about a client's deployment ultimately failing because of a poor decision they're making, you do have a decision to make there as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great question. Thank you so much for asking. Anyone else? I didn't know if I saw any other hands before we move on. Nope. Okay. All right. So another interesting perspective of this is something that I was talking to our head of product development, product management, and I was asking him about what did he think was, a key takeaway for any person who's out there trying to sell or market IoT, LPWAN, all of that. The big comment that he gave back to me was know your audience. And I think this is interesting because it kind of leads into his question, but defining your customers' needs, product parameters, and understanding their internal limitations. So if you know that they're an IoT know-it-all or that they lack engineering capacity, you already kind of prepare yourself for the fact that they may disagree with you wrongly, right? Knowing which message to send to which audience is so important for the salesperson in that conversation. Who are you talking to? Are you talking to a nerd? Or are you talking to someone who only cares about specs? Or are you talking to a decision maker who doesn't want to hear anything about the nerd or spec concerns, right? They just want to know, how can I make money off this? And how little can I spend, right? So I wanted to ask you, Dave, your thoughts on knowing your audience and, really feeling like you understand who you're talking to as a salesperson when you're trying to sell LPWAN or LoRaWAN.
Yeah, that's another thing you're going to run into. Usually, if it's a technology like LoRaWAN, and there's some proposed new solution, that is usually being brought into the company by technology people, right? Could be IT, could be engineers, could be whoever. And they're trying to put together a solution that will bring benefit to the company. They have the best interests of the company in mind. But as I mentioned before, having reported to CFOs, it's going to be that CFO that's going to quantify really what that means to the company. And that person doesn't care about technology, right? So the idea is when you're talking to the people who are trying to bring the solution into the company, you need to work with them to try and have them go internally and talk to those people who will be defining what it really means to the company, right? A lot of salespeople will try and jump over and go straight to the CFO. That's not going to work. But if you ask questions about, okay, what are the financial goals, right? Or how does this or that have to work with your solution? That's going to cause them to go to someone else in the company to answer. That's a good thing to do, right? Because what you're doing is you're getting that input from those decision makers that you're getting it indirectly. So hopefully you'll get it accurately, but you're at least getting it. And that's going to make your solution better in the end.
Right. Yeah. And I think, really putting a lot of thought into what are you trying to do? So knowing your audience is important in any of those equations. But when you're trying to, say, create a marketing asset for LPWAN, thinking really extensively about who do you want to click on that, read it, and get the right takeaway, right? But when you're trying to sell LPWAN, when you're trying to sell a product or a solution for that, trying to premeditate a bit what questions they're going to have. So patterns of questions that you see from time to time, is it really all the same across whether you're talking to, a utilities customer or municipalities customer versus when you're talking to a more consumer-oriented device customer? Do you feel like you're getting asked the same questions, or you feel like there's a fragmentation there?
Very different. Municipalities. So I've been recently talking to municipalities about smart waste. So what is smart waste, right? It's a sensor, some connectivity, the data goes to the cloud, tells you if it's empty or full. That's only moderately interesting, right? How is that going to really benefit a municipality? Well, if you couple it with an AI backend that looks at that data over time and says you take those people, that truck on that route on that day, and you're done, that's a much better kind of solution, right? And they can look at that, and what they're concerned about is, how is that going to affect what I do today in terms of costs and people? Municipalities, in general, that's what they focus on. If you're an enterprise, the enterprise is going to have other things they think about. The enterprises are generally going to be more concerned with data security and how they deploy it, and then how they can leverage that data. Sure, they're going to have maybe smart waste. Maybe it's like a Waste management is a big company, right? So maybe it's them, but then what else can they do with that data? Can they, I hate to say it, but sell it, right? Can they use it for other applications? Can they work with, I don't know, landfill operators and gain some additional benefit, right? So there's enterprises are generally more flexible when it comes to the data and want to use it in more different places.
Absolutely. So before I think actually we've kind of like danced all around this a bit. So I kind of want to move us into the next section. I don't really think we're going to have a whole lot of questions on knowing your audience. Before I move us, any questions on knowing your audience, tips, tricks, anything like that? Okay. So now let's get into hidden costs, because you actually talked about this earlier. You talked about subscriptions. I'm sure we probably both have customer stories that we can share anonymously, things like that. Let's talk a little bit about how do we get our salespeople, our people who are taking this to market, to understand preparing your customer for hidden unknown costs. So do you want to start us out?
Sure. That's a big topic, because there's a lot of hidden costs. There's the hidden cost of the solution itself. For example, most solutions, you start out with a certain bit of data or information that you're gathering and acting on, but then it's an IoT solution. So it usually grows, and that the number and different types of data points grow, right? Well, what does that do? Well, your connectivity can double, can triple in cost. And if you don't know that before you deploy it and account for that in your pricing model, your CFO is not going to be very happy at all. And at some point, you're going to have an IoT solution that has been frozen, not because the engineers can't do it, but because the finance side says, no, not doing it. So that's one thing. But things like battery lifetime, right? You have to assume that if you're going to be doing that kind of IoT solution, that you're going to spend about 1 to 10% of your battery life on firmware updates over the air, if your system supports that. If you lose 10% of your system's lifetime, that is often the difference between a profitable system and a non-profitable system. So you have to be very careful as you're planning these things out, that you don't design in these costs that make you fail in the future, no matter how good your solution is, right? Other things, we've mentioned IoT Readiness Assessment. So there's a number of customers or companies that, especially manufacturing, and like I said, they aren't set up to do subscription management. And implementing a subscription management capability in a company is a non-trivial effort. There are entire other companies, Ready Wireless, for example, does an awesome job at that. And it's taken work for them, right? They had to do a lot of work. This is not easy. If you design in something into a solution that requires you to have that and you don't, you're not going to make any money in that solution. Period.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you're going to have a pretty upset CFO, right?
Yep.
Absolutely.
You notice I'm not talking about the CEO, right?
We all know who holds the real
happy.
keys. Yeah.
He's happy to brag
Yep.
about the solution and talk about all the great things you're doing and
Exactly.
all that. But it's the CFO that's going to come in and stop you and make sure that it makes money for the enterprise.
Yeah, and you brought up FODA, and I think FODA is a really interesting one, because a lot of times when you think about sales and marketing, you're not thinking about the technical person in the room. You're like, okay, how does a regular sales guy go in and sell this solution? And he's likely not, he may not be an engineer, right? So FODA may not mean a whole lot to him. But one of the things that I think is interesting is paying attention to what's going on in the ecosystem. What buzzwords are you hearing? What things are you hearing being discussed as a repetitive problem? If 30 people on LinkedIn are trying to push a photo solution, some type of tool, or some type of photo-oriented design, it's probably a red flag that your company needs to get your salespeople to understand the relationship of photo to LoRaWAN. So we have a customer, for instance, that has thousands of devices in the field that cannot OTA. These devices are buried in the ground. They're very difficult to take out. It's a huge ordeal now. And they had a choice for so many years of, do they just leave it alone because it's not broken? Or at some point, are they going to run into a very real problem with these devices? And they bravely made the decision to go ahead and fix that now. Your average salesperson does not know how to anticipate that conversation when writing a contract or unearthing requirements or any of those things. You know, what I guess in my thought, it's really paying attention to what's going on in the ecosystem. But I don't know if you had anything to add to that.
It is, and unfortunately, it's even broader than that. Within the LoRa Alliance, we have a group. It's called the Regional Parameters Group. Today, it's run by Dave Chundall. I used to run it. It is the group that is responsible for a specification that says how LoRa runs in any given, say, country that has its own different rules, right? And so the reason why we have to have a specification is those rules change. So you could have deployed an awesome solution that does everything you want and you're making money at it, and the company of the country that you deploy it in changes their rules. And now you have to go back and abide by the rules,
right?
Which is going to be certification time. But then for those kinds of sensors that you can't update over the air, you've got to take them all out and replace them, right? So sometimes it's not your fault, but you do live in this environment where the regulatory environment is out of your control, but you're subject to it. So there's another big issue.
Yeah, and that's a good point too, because I mean, a lot of times what I see is the person who didn't anticipate the need for that feature. But I think you bringing up the point that the change of technology, the flow and fragmentation of technology can actually cause those problems for you as well. And that's where flexibility is important too, right? So what about, you know, when you're asking these questions and you're thinking about these hidden costs, what about, you know, just out of curiosity, who in here is a LoRa Alliance member? You better raise your hand, Hisham. You work for me. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, so we have a good number of members. One of the whole points of, you know, leveraging a technology alliance, you know, it's a standard like that, is that you have access to information. You're going to frequently see white papers, and you're going to see podcasts and webinars, and you're going to hear a lot of these hidden costs discussed in all kinds of different ways from that. So the question is then, how important is it for your marketing team to be plugged into any kind of industry alliance that you're a part of, or that you maybe aren't a part of but should be? Anybody here engaged in an alliance beyond the LoRa Alliance that just you're getting a lot of information from it, you find it useful? Or do we have non-marketing people in here? Any thoughts on that? No?
No.
They need to do some yoga, I think. That's what needs to happen. All right. So hidden costs. Any other thoughts? We've covered IoT subscriptions. We've covered, you know, CapEx versus OpEx. I know EveryNet is here in the audience. They actually schooled me once because I was in a session and talked about how, oh, well, there's ways to get around CapEx or get around the OpEx problem for like oil and gas. And then they literally came up to me at the end of the show and said, you do know we already do that. Like, we don't even have to create that, right? So talking to the different key infrastructure parts of the ecosystem, like the network, you know, the semiconductor manufacturer, the chip manufacturers, all of them, finding out from them, what do you not know that you should know for your customer, and having a good relationship. We've got subscriptions. Any other thoughts? We've done FODA.
Yeah. One thing, you know, we all live in a dynamic environment, right? Today, if you're going to deploy a LoRa solution and you are going to be buying connectivity, you're not going to be running your own network. So EveryNet, for example, is going to sell you connectivity. Most of the providers there will charge you by the message. They'll charge you like an annual fee to have the device. And so you need to track these things, right? Because those are your costs. Those are the basis of your costs. Where the market's going right now is it's getting simpler. And what you can expect is, because this drives CFOs nuts, right? How can they control how many messages are sent if they can't predict how many messages are going to be sent, for example? The market is moving, like the cellular world, to more unlimited data plan sort of thing, right? Where you pay one fee, is it once a year, once a month, whatever, but it doesn't change. You put your device there. Your CFO's happy because he can make a chart that goes off as far in the future as he wants, and he knows what his costs are. So some of the market changes that are going on now are going to make some of these issues go away, right? And it's happening. And by 6 months from now, you should start seeing some of these appear in the market.
Yeah, great thoughts on that too. Will every net ready wireless see us at the end of this for your bribe for mentioning you so much? We'll be sure to give it to you. I mean, we've covered a ton here. We've covered, I think, what are the most important parts of this.
Yeah.
Only thought is, we briefly talked, and we've got just like 3 minutes left before we need to end, but we briefly touched on data strategy.
Mm-hmm.
And I think something else that I have heard repeatedly is in getting a salesperson to understand the customer, getting them to understand the importance of getting the customer to understand actionable intelligence and the value of it. So your customer is telling you, I want to monitor the noise level in my neighborhood, for 10 neighborhoods, because I think that's going to get a big IoT contract for me.
Mm-hmm.
And then getting them to have that conversation with you and find out, is that actually the right actionable intelligent data that they need? Right. So I just to close this out, any thoughts on actionable intelligent data?
Oh, sure. There's a lot you can do with even small amounts of data, right? You can take almost any sensor, temperature sensor, pressure, whatever, and it's measuring data periodically. So that's called time series data. That is highly amenable to being fed into a machine learning model and doing all sorts of cool stuff. So for example, if you have a vibration sensor on your refrigerator's compressor, okay, you can read that. You can, is it within bounds or not? But if you take that data and you feed it into a machine learning algorithm or model, that thing will start telling you when that compressor is going to fail. Surprisingly accurately, by the way. Not just next year, but that week. And sometimes that day, depending on how good your model is and how much history you've had to train it with. So data should start being very simple, right? But with good IoT solutions, you need to start understanding what you can do with that data. Some of that is feeding it into an AI platform, a machine learning platform. Some of it is filtering or comparing. You taking two different sets of data and merging them together. If you overlay them, you can often get new insights into what that data is telling you. So when you're talking about data strategies, mm-hmm. you should look to the future about what you want to do with information that you're already getting, is my point. Because I mentioned the dangers of just trying to flood your cloud with all sorts of data. You don't need that much, generally.
Yep, agreed. I think it's just understanding the data you need, understanding mm-hmm. where that data needs to be, where you want to have the data. And from the very beginning of your solution, really asking yourself hard questions about how you want to disseminate and handle that data. So, well, that's the end of what we have here. We used our whole time. We got a few questions. I think I am also supposed to remind you that if you are a member of the LoRa Alliance, it's important that you complete the project prioritization assessment survey. So please do that. I believe there's going to be some slides available to process that.
Yes. Definitely.
Dave and I will sit up here for a few minutes at the end. So anybody who has questions, thoughts, anything they'd like to share, we'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks for joining us.
And by the way, thank you. I mentioned IoT Readiness Assessment. James walked in. He doesn't want me to say anything, but he's sitting right there if you'd like to talk to him about it.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.